Welcome to the Voices of Manufacturing, where business leaders across the industry share their unique challenges and insights. Brought to you by Dazuki.
Welcome to the Voices of Manufacturing podcast. I'm your host, Brian Salee, and joining me today is Kevin Hendrickson. Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Well, Kevin, we've got a great topic today that we're going to hit on, which is, how do you get started with robotic automation? But before we dig into that, you mind giving the audience a little bit of a background on your history in manufacturing?
Sure. So I went to Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, California. Studied mechanical engineering, bachelor's and a master's degree. Meanwhile, while I was at school, I interned for Ernie Music Man, and they manufacture guitars. And I ended up staying on full time for nearly 14 years. And during my time there, I did a lot of manufacturing, including some automation. And now I work for PetDoors.com as the director of engineering.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that introduction. I'm excited to discuss this topic today around robotic automation. I've been in some pretty automated manufacturing plants, and including the Tesla plant up in Fremont, which was just mind blowing to see the amount of automation going on there. But what I'm really fascinated by, and I think a lot of our audiences as well, is if you're a smaller manufacturer, how do you get started with automation? And we're kind of reaching that point now where the cost to implement robots is, it's well within reach of most manufacturers. And then the other thing, which is the expertise to implement it and maintain it. And I know you've got an interesting background on how you gained your expertise there, but that's another thing that's become more widespread. There's more people out there that have done it before and have experience. So let's dig in. As you mentioned, you previously worked at Ernie Music Man. You've got a great success story on how you guys implemented some automation. But before we dig in too far there, what does Ernie manufacture?
Yeah, so Ernie Music Man manufactures the Music Man line of electric guitars and basses. And those are made from literally raw lumber to a finished instrument. And they're very high end, very nice. And labor has always been kind of an issue in San Luis Obispo, getting enough labor, also just getting the right kind of labor to operate machinery and equipment. So there was a little bit of a drive there to automate from the owner. And that's kind of where we got started.
Yeah, so you guys are making from raw lumber, like you're saying. I can't remember, you guys call them like blanks or something like that. You start with a big piece of wood, and out at the very end of the factory comes a finished guitar, painted, everything, right?
Right, yeah. So now the whole factory is not automated, but there are definitely big portions, specifically in the wood manufacturing side, that we added some robotic automation to help with labor and capacity and throughput. And we can kind of dig into those one by one if we want.
Yeah, let's start with that. So it sounds like part of the initial driver was some challenges around labor, just having enough people, and then maybe people who are qualified have that skill level. Was that really the starting point? Because lots of companies are going through this right now where they're having trouble filling open roles.
It was a combination of labor shortage in our area, and then also just the rising cost of labor. And in the particular market that Music Man was in, that was going to affect the margins by quite a bit. And so the ownership wanted to find ways to not only reduce that cost, but also increase capacity within the footprint of the building we're in. And so there was sort of a multi-pronged effort of increased capacity, reduce labor as labor was hard to get, but also expensive and getting more expensive. And that was sort of the drive. And after that, it was sort of like, well, how do we do it, right?
Yeah, and when you say increased capacity, that's increased capacity without expanding the size of the footprint of the factory. Is that right?
Yeah. So, and I'll get into this, but the way we did that was essentially design a robotic system that could work after everyone leaves and shuts the door and turn the lights off, and it's still making guitar bodies and necks.
So, so true lights out manufacturing. No one's in the building, and you guys are still producing.
Yeah, I mean there were days where it ran 23 hours a day for a couple days at a time. Usually we'd have some maintenance or cleanup, or maybe that was all we needed for that particular week or something. But it gave us that capacity to grow and expand without adding a labor force, and just get the throughput that we need without expanding footprint as well.
Interesting. So going back though, you mentioned the owners were already focused on this. I imagine there's a lot of companies, that maybe don't have ownership that's involved, maybe a little more disconnected with, what's going on in the factory. Was there anything that you guys did with the owners to kind of prove out, the ROI of bringing in automation?
Oh, absolutely. Even though we wanted to do it, it still needed to make sense, right? So, we kind of over time developed our own internal calculation, using ROI or, total cost and maybe duration of when will it start to pay back. You can kind of do that and take into consideration labor savings, material cost savings, scrap savings. If your quality is higher, you can reduce scrap. And in our case, the scrap was very expensive, so that was a big deal. And basically work out like a payback period. And so typically, if it was 3 years or less, we considered it worth doing. And then it was just a matter of prioritizing projects that made sense.
Got it. So you guys really focused in on those areas, as you mentioned, where are there potential savings? And obviously labor is a big one. It sounds like you mentioned, scrap waste being one as well. Is that because when you bring in robotics, you've got improved quality compared to when you had a human doing it, and now you're just wasting less?
Yeah, it's a combination of improved quality. Also, you remove some of the human mistakes and errors that happen naturally when you've got maybe new trainees doing something. You've got a consistent, controllable system that's going to do the same thing every time, within reason, of course.
Got it.
Yeah.
So you guys built out this ROI, management was on board, and then now you got approval for the project. You're getting started. Where you already had an idea of where you wanted to start, it sounded like. How did you guys select that area?
Yeah, so I think selecting a project to start as your very first one, I think it is kind of a good idea to start simple, especially if you're going to do the work internally and learn the process and learn how to program robots and how to spec automation equipment. Starting simple was a great way for us to get started. So we had a particular machine that we needed more capacity on. And after kind of creating my proposal, this is what I think it'll cost, how long it'll take, this is the ROI, these are the kind of things that it will save. And they said, go for it. And I'm really thankful that the company trusted me to take on that new project and that new avenue of education. But I think it paid off in the end for the company, and we got some good automation equipment out of it.
Yeah, so that's interesting. And this is like it's kind of the DIY model. You did it yourself, essentially taught yourself. I'd love to understand maybe how you, learn more about, how do you implement systems like this. But what was the decision-making process that you guys had? Why didn't you bring in an outside vendor to come in and help set this up?
So in the past, 1999, in fact, before I was there, they did actually hire an outside company to put in some robotic automation for the buffing area. So that's where they sort of shine up the paint on the guitar to make it nice and glossy. So they put in a robot and programmed all these buffing wheels to automatically buff out the guitars. And it turned out to be a little bit of a challenge, or to say a lot of a challenge. It took the company much, much longer than expected. There was programming issues, the quality wasn't as good. And what ended up happening was my boss ended up having to finish out the whole project and make it work for the quality level we needed. And so I think ownership was a little bit turned off by outsourcing and really wanted to try doing it ourselves from the start. And that was, I think, the main driver of let's see if this young kid from Cal Poly can learn this stuff and take it on and take off with it.
Yeah. So the previous experience obviously weighed in the decision to have you. They must have had a lot of trust in you. Where did you got this project approved and, hey, Kevin, you're going to go out and, build this robotic automated system for us in this area. What was your first step? Where did you turn to start learning about how to implement robotics?
I think my first step was just kind of freaking out a little bit because I literally knew almost nothing about automation. But it turned out that it's intimidating to look at the big whole picture, but if you break it up, it's actually not that bad. Like, robots are pretty similar to like a CNC. You can move them around wherever you want. Teaching them is not actually really easy. Might have been the easiest part of the whole thing. And then everything else is just, how do you hold something? How do you grip it? And how do you tell it something to turn on and off? And, it sounds intimidating at first, but if you take it step by step and you kind of lean into your vendors a little bit and ask them for help, you'll find lots of help online and documentation. It's not so bad. And if you kind of start with a simple project and get your feet wet, the next one can be more complex and maybe more, instead of semi-automated, it's fully automated, or it goes lights out, or some other level of implementation. So yeah, it's intimidating, but you just break it up.
Yeah, I like that's a great piece of advice. Yeah, if you try to look at the entire project as a whole, very intimidating, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You mentioned your vendors helped out quite a bit, it sounds like. So whoever you bought your robot from, they actually provided a lot of support, post-sales support to you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So with Fanuc is the robotic system we ended up choosing. Part of the reason we chose them over some of the others was their willingness to support and help. And I mean, I was on like speed dial with my rep, and we would email back and forth. He would send me schematics and help me along and give me advice. And not only the robotic side, but also you'll find a good vendor for your automation supplies, your actuators and your PLCs and your HMIs and all the other equipment that goes along with that. And these guys are a wealth of information. They know the whole industry. And if they don't know it, they know 3 other people that know it. And they're so willing to help you. I really leaned into those things. And without them, I think it would have been very, very challenging. And with them, it made the whole project doable.
Yeah, that's great to have such great support from your vendors. Now, in terms of challenges, obviously learning, how to implement a system like this is a big challenge. What were some of the other challenges? And I'm really interested, especially in that, you were the main person implementing this system. If anything happened to you, you got sick or whatever, what was the backup plan and how did you guys come up with the backup plan?
Well, yes, I was, for the most part, the main person working on the project, but I was also, working, I'd bounce ideas off with my boss. And then we had an electrical engineer that that helped out with some of the schematics on the first cell. And yeah, I mean, if I was out, probably not much was happening on it. But once it was developed, being able to document how to fix common issues using Dazuki helped a lot with that, because I could document a pretty complex set of tasks to fix maybe a semi-common issue, and could easily hand that off to someone on the floor to operate and do. So a lot of times if I was out and the robot went down, and they would find the solution in Dazuki. And if not, they could let me know, and I'd add it the next time I was back, and it would be in there forever. So that's kind of how we dealt with that.
Yeah, and so the other part, you've got, and these people who would maintain or troubleshoot, were these just standard operators, or were these other engineers that were on staff that would do any type of troubleshooting and maintenance?
It depends. There were certain sets of tasks that were for the engineering team only, probably required getting into the PLC program. But for more mechanical type fixes, oftentimes the operators or our maintenance team could step in and handle it without problem.
Got it. So the key, you've captured some of your knowledge, documented it, basically trained everybody else, on how to troubleshoot these issues. And that made it a much more sustainable program to kind of maintain.
Absolutely. And especially as I was stepping away from the company, I made a massive effort to document everything I did. So for the last 2 months, every time I went to the robot, I documented what I just did. And so now all of that information is available to the engineers and operators. And it's pretty rare that I get a call from my old buddies and say, hey, there's some issue that we need to solve that wasn't documented. It's only happened a couple times in 2 years. So I would say it went pretty well.
That's great. You're an awesome former employee then, if you're still picking up the phone and helping troubleshoot issues every now and then.
Oh yeah. I mean, the guys there are still some of my best friends, so not going to leave them hanging.
Yeah, that's really neat. Well, talking on the people side then, you're bringing in, automation. Obviously, employees get concerned. This is something you hear about all the time. And, how big of a deal is it really, though, is, automation is going to replace our jobs is a concern, that you hear from some companies, some operators. How did you guys handle that in, letting the operators know, hey, here's why we're doing this? What was that conversation like? Did you have to educate them a lot, or were they very understanding from the very beginning?
I think that's actually a really important question, and something every small and medium-sized company should be thinking about before they get started. I do think you should have a plan in place for explaining and a plan for how to keep your employees on and elevate them to bring, I don't know, new tasks to their list of skills. So in our case at Ernie Ball Music Man, we would basically tell the employees that the automation was not taking jobs. We're not planning any layoffs. We, in fact, will have opportunities for some of these employees to elevate their skill level and operate the machinery. And it allows us to increase our throughput. And by doing that, we don't necessarily have to add labor, but we don't want to get rid of any, because we're trying to increase, right? So we're increasing capacity and throughput by adding these machines, sometimes doing tasks that are just sort of repetitive, something maybe the employees aren't enjoying doing necessarily. But now we're giving some of these employees opportunities to do really fun tasks and take care of the robotics. And what I would do when I was down there early on during building and laying it out is I would bring some of those employees in and ask for their opinions on something and say, hey, if I put this over here, do you think that makes sense? If you're loading stuff from here, and I would get their opinion. And if possible, I try to implement that. So that does a couple things. One, you're getting the opinions of the people that actually do this work. Oftentimes they know more than than the engineers. And the other is they take ownership. They now have a piece of this machine that they were involved in. And if you can bring those employees in early into that process, maybe bring them into a meeting, have a brainstorm session, they're going to be so much more excited about it, and excited about the things that they could possibly do with it, that I think it'll make everyone sort of buy in.
Wow, that's a really solid piece of advice. So engaging with the operators during the implementation phase was sounds like it was really key for you guys to get their buy-in.
Yeah, it worked out really well, and in the end, I think where there could have been some sour attitudes, it turned into, exciting.
Yeah, and those operators that did were there certain people that just naturally gravitated to this type of project? These operators were like, hey, I really want to develop skills in that area. And how did you identify those people, or did they kind of self-identify?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there were definitely some kind of obvious choices, but there was a couple less obvious where you maybe didn't expect this particular person to get involved, but they sort of put themselves in there, and wasn't the type of employee that I would necessarily think would be ready for a high technical type job, but because they put that interest and effort into it, I said, let's go for it. And I trained them, and they turned out to be great, and really worked well with the equipment.
Yeah, I could really see that for an operator, leveling up your skill level, wherever you want to go work after Ernie Ball Music Man, probably lots more opportunities if you have that level of skill working with robotics.
Definitely a resume builder.
Yeah. Well, got an understanding of, kind of how you guys implemented, it sounds like, things went well. And then did you guys expand from there and bring automation into other areas? And then if you did, what was kind of the decision-making process for where to expand next?
Yeah. So the first automation cell that I put in was essentially a CNC tending robot that would load and unload raw wood blanks, mills them into a guitar, and then the robot brings it over and drills a bunch of holes for the wires with some peripheral drills. And that was sort of an entry level programming and integration task. And I think it was a great lead in for the next one, which was another CNC tending operation, but it was way more complex because of all the skills I had learned from the first one. The second one, we did guitar necks, and it was RFID scanning and database feeding the machine what to build. And it was smart motors and automated label applicating. And it was a lot more complex version of some of the skills I learned on the first. And that was sort of a scaled up version. If you're talking about scaling up for automation through the factory, that was sort of taking some skills, implementing them in another area, but also expanding that. Beyond that, my boss also put in a painting automation cell, and that one would basically apply the sealer coat and any finish coats on the guitars and necks.
Got it. So all from there on out, it was all pretty much anywhere where there was labor intensive. You had to have somebody standing next to that CNC machine loading and unloading.
Yeah.
You automated those type of tasks, get those out of the way.
Yeah. And it wasn't, so we were kind of unique in that we were what you call a low volume, high mix.
Yeah.
So we didn't make 10,000 widgets, right? We made like 2 or 3 of this and 1 of that and 4 of that and 6 of these. And so automating that can be difficult. And so one of the challenges with that is just organizing and making sure the right things are being made. So part of the automation was sort of making that simpler and taking a complex organizational task and having it automate through a database. Now, sorry, I forgot what your original question was, but I kind of just went off into the.
No, that's perfect. No,
Yeah.
that's because I think that's key too. Is automation. The perception is it's always high volume, right? And what you're saying here, low volume, high mix. It's actually another great area to use automation. It's just much more sophisticated.
There's definitely little tricks and skills you can do to do that kind of automation. And I noticed going through automation trade shows that there's definitely a little bit of a trend towards sort of working on those kind of problems. Whereas, I don't know, 10 years ago, if you didn't have a high volume of something, you just wouldn't automate. But there are definitely options now.
Yeah. Well, this is great. This has been really helpful, Kevin. Really last thing I wanted to ask you here, any suggestions for folks out there that are considering bringing some automation into their factory, any, resources that, you found really helpful that we could, point them to?
I would say, find a good automation equipment supplier, a vendor. They're going to have lots of resources for helping you design a system and spec out the equipment for it. As far as like what projects to do within your factory, I think looking for tasks that are high in labor or are very repetitive or have the potential for injury. These are all things that you want to look for developing a project. And go to a trade show. The Automate trade show and the ATX West and ATX East are great places for, you can just walk around. There's many 10s, 20, 30 integrators. An integrator is someone who can install a system in your factory. And they'll give you so much advice right there on the spot. They'll obviously want to gain your business if you're looking to outsource. But even if you're doing it internally, it's a great place to network and get ideas and get some questions answered.
That's great. Yeah, now that we're going to back to in-person events, we're all itching to get out there and hit some trade shows up. So that's a good suggestion. Well, Kevin, thank you for joining us on the Voices of Manufacturing podcast. Appreciate your time, and thank you.
Yeah, no problem. It was fun.
Thank you for listening to the Voices of Manufacturing, brought to you by Dazuki. To stay up to date, subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Visit dazuki.com/podcast to learn more.